Hello there, everybody. This is Jake Wynn from the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, coming at you for another one of our digital programs hosted here on the National Museum of Civil War Medicine's YouTube channel. My name is Jake Wynn. I am Director of Interpretation at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. I'm going to be presenting today's program, which is going to be about one specific amputation that took place at the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse in May of 1864. We're going to be focusing today on a couple of characters from the 96th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry, a unit that is very close and near and dear to my heart, as it is part of Pennsylvania where I grew up. It's where this unit originated. So in eastern Pennsylvania, an area known as Schuylkill County. We're going to be focusing today on the story of Captain Edwin Severn, who is an officer in that unit who is severely injured, severely wounded during the course of the fighting at Spotsylvania Courthouse. We're going to focus a little bit on his surgeon as well, who is going to perform a very dangerous amputation in the field at Spotsylvania Courthouse in May of 1864. And we're also going to talk a little bit about the long-standing consequences of an amputation, even for a survivor like Edwin Severn. A little bit of spoiler, he is going to survive his amputation, but in the years that followed, he's going to be dealing with many complications from that wound. And his family is also going to be dealing with the complications of his wartime service as well. So before we get into the program, just want to touch on a few items that for those of you who've been watching the channel over the last year are very familiar with. If you can support the program and the channel by going ahead and clicking the subscribe button, you can like this video if you enjoy it as well. That helps more people to join in to see, and you can always share the program on social media as well. So share the video. That allows more people to see in your networks what we're doing at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and to get them involved in watching our programs as well. If you want to take your support to the next level, you can become a member of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and you will get great member perks, free admission to the museum, access to programs, special publications that come just to you with the latest information about Civil War medicine. And the research that we are conducting at the museum, as well as knowing that you will be supporting programs like this. So it's kind of twofold. You get something from us, and we get something from you. You're allowing us to continue doing what we do at the museum, what we're so passionate and excited about, fulfilling our mission at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. So you can find a link to our membership program, find out more about it in the notes underneath this video. And I hope you'll consider doing so. It will, as I mentioned, give you lots of cool perks as well as support videos like this one. So with that being said, let's dive into today's program. We are going to be talking about something, in a single surgical operation. It's a little different than the programs that we've done before on this channel, where we've talked about systems, we talk about battlefield medicine writ large, we talk with historians, we talk about kind of how Civil War medicine is continuing to impact our lives today. I want to step back a little bit from that. I want to go from the 10,000-foot level and get down to the very nitty gritty and specifics to talk about a single officer, a single operation, a single surgeon, and in the aftermath of the war, a single widow, a soldier's wife who is going to have to deal with the implications in the aftermath of a Civil War amputation, and then also the long-standing implications of the surgical operation and wartime wounds when her husband passes away in the years after the war, and her kind of remarkable story. So let's dive into the story. So we're going to be talking about May 1864 here. One battle in particular that I find particularly compelling, and I know many of you do as well, and that's the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, just west and south of Fredericksburg, Virginia. The second battle in what becomes known as the Overland Campaign in May 1864 takes place in the aftermath of the Battle of the Wilderness in Virginia, a famous battle, famously horrible battle, and this is going to be a continuation of that fighting. And this is going to be a really interesting transition point in kind of the tactical doctrine of the Civil War, where we're seeing less focus on open field battles. Think Gettysburg, Pickett's Charge, Cemetery Ridge, less of that kind of fighting and more of field fortifications and defensive works, trenches. These soldiers are beginning to fight more like we're going to see in the First World War, right? Where we're using trenches, we're digging in because we understand that the value of doing that. And so in this intense fighting that's going on at Spotsylvania Courthouse in the middle of May 1864, we have a unit is going to really be engaged in this some hellish, horrific combat in intense ways. Many of the Army of the Potomac, the Army of Northern Virginia, are going to have experienced horrific, seemingly never-ending combat experiences during this campaign. We're going to focus in on the 96th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry, and let's bring them to Spotsylvania Courthouse. So after endless days of combat in the woods and thickets of central Virginia, Dr. Daniel Webster Bland of the 96th Pennsylvania Volunteers took time from his busy days and nights in a field hospital to pen a letter to a colleague in his native Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania. He needed to tell of the horrors of what he had seen and heard at the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, specifically on May 10th, 1864. This is what he wrote. He says, quote, "The shelling is the worst feature of the war. Oh, they are terrible missiles. It is frightful to hear them tearing, crashing, howling, and screaming like so many unseen fiends through the air, then bursting and scattering their destructive fragments in all directions." He wrote that 10 days after the battle to which he is referring. He writes this letter on May 20th, 1864, as the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse is drawing to an end. It's very likely the first time he actually had a bit of a break to actually pen a letter because he is so busy as the unit surgeon. So Dr. Bland had been a surgeon in the 96th Pennsylvania since 1861, and he is right there in the thick of numerous combat operations. We'll touch on those that the 96th Pennsylvania experienced in just a bit. He knows the carnage of the Civil War. He has experienced Civil War field hospitals and their evolutions since 1861, and so he is involved. He knows how this war has evolved, how it's become more deadly, how it's become more dangerous for the soldiers. But he has become much more skillful, along with many of his colleagues in the Army of the Potomac, as well as in all of these Civil War armies. Their medical teams have become much more adapted and adept at surgical intervention to save lives. And Dr. Bland is experiencing this. And he is in the thick of it again, just as his comrades are out on the front lines fighting. He is in the front lines of the battle to save lives in the wake of these heavy combat operations that the 96th and other members of the 6th Army Corps are going to experience during the battles of the Wilderness and Spotsylvania Courthouse. So in the days leading up to May 10th, 1864, he had been attempting to mend the broken bodies of his fellow Pennsylvanians. Among those he treats at Spotsylvania Courthouse, though, is a gentleman named Captain Edwin Severn of Company K, 96th Pennsylvania. In the same letter that I referred to earlier, he wrote specifically of this wounded officer. He says, quote, "Captain Edwin Severn, whose arm I removed, is doing well at last accounts." So this was the entry point for me into this specific story, is this newspaper article, a little casual reference to this specific soldier after that very vivid description of the artillery fire that was taking place at the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse and its consequences. And so I was intrigued by this, to figure out, is there a way to figure out who Edwin Severn was, what kind of operation he experienced? And you see, he has an amputation of some sort, the most common surgical operation of the American Civil War. And so I wanted to figure out a little bit more about this. Who was he? What can we find out about his medical history? And it turns out there's going to be quite a bit. We can tell actually quite a bit of the story. So let's talk a little bit about Edwin Severn here. Up until 1864, Captain Severn had lived something of a charmed life in the United States Army. After serving among the first responders, this is one of the first units to arrive at the United States Capitol in April 1861 after Fort Sumter. He goes on to serve as an officer within Captain Richard Budd's company of Schuylkill County soldiers, Company K, 96th Pennsylvania. They were attached to that unit at Pottsville in 1861, Pottsville, Pennsylvania, before heading off to the front lines of war. With the 96th, Captain Severn faced hellish combat at a number of the war's lesser known engagements. This is one of the kind of interesting elements of the 96th Pennsylvania and much of the 6th Corps of the Union Army up to the Overland Campaign of 1864. They are not, in some cases, involved in some of the kind of marquee battles in the Eastern Theater of the war. They're in kind of the B-level battles, which in many cases is still intense combat and horrible, but is not going to get a lot of the fame that many of their comrades are getting in the Army of the Potomac. So the battles that they fight at, South Mountain, Salem Church outside Chancellorsville in 1863, and Rappahannock Station later on in 1863. They are not going to be playing major roles in battles like Antietam or Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville. They're not in that engagement directly. In the Battle of Gettysburg, they are largely inactive, arriving on the battlefield on the second day of July 1863 and not playing a major role other than to act as a kind of reinforcement and reserve at the Battle of Gettysburg. So by the spring of 1864, these men are hardened veterans, though they have not experienced necessarily the same massive, large-scale battle and participated in that many of their colleagues and comrades in the Army of the Potomac have. They have indeed experienced combat and have proved themselves on battlefields. There are some occasions where they didn't serve as well. I won't get into that too much, but this is a unit that is very much one that has had a varied experience in combat during the war to this point, proving themselves adept on some battlefields and not so much on others. And Captain Severn is involved in this. He is promoted over the course of his Civil War service from lieutenant to captain of Company K. And not only, of course, are they facing the 96th Pennsylvania, are they facing combat, they're also facing disease as well. And disease, as it did with many Civil War units, wreaked havoc in the ranks of these soldiers, taking out many of those who served, either causing fatal illness or severe debilitating illness that requires medical resignations or men to go home and leave the army because they have been kind of permanently disabled by their illnesses. So they have experienced kind of the full range, the full gamut of Civil War experiences to this point. But what they're going to experience in May of 1864 is at an entirely different level. This is, by many magnitudes, a more significant, more painful, more awful experience than that they have experienced to this point. So they are, Captain Severn and the 96th are rousted from their camps in Virginia in May 4th, 1864, and sent marching into the tangled thicket known as the Wilderness. They're going to face off against the Confederate forces in very close quarters combat amid choking smoke and raging wildfires at the Battle of the Wilderness on May 5th and May 6th, 1864, taking casualties in the course of that action. Days later, though, they're pushed to the south to face an entrenched foe on the outskirts of a tiny village called Spotsylvania Courthouse, about a dozen or so miles southwest of Fredericksburg. Now, Captain Severn and his company, they are going to face a pretty unpleasant life in what are going to become the trenches of Spotsylvania Courthouse. They're going to be with the 6th Corps. Their line is going to stretch opposite of a strongly fortified Confederate position known as the Mule Shoe, what's going to become known as the Mule Shoe Salient. This defensive line featured rifle pits or trenches that protected Confederate riflemen. Much to the Union soldiers' chagrin, artillery was also dug into the Confederate line and consistently blasted away at U.S. Army lines, only in some cases a few hundred yards away. And this is where that pivot point in Civil War history, we are fully into defensive fortifications, field works, trenches, abattis. These battle lines are literally digging themselves into the earth. No longer are they just a line of or two of men, but we now have a line or two of men dug into entrenched positions. The Union Army, U.S. Army, is also entrenching as well. And what I find most compelling, just a kind of an aside here, what I find most compelling about these battles in the 1864 campaign, and having worked on the Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania battlefield, got to work with these in these locations quite frequently in 2015. You can literally see where these soldiers were serving in trenches that they themselves dug. And that is just something it's a little more difficult to see at a place like Gettysburg or Antietam, to see that the soldiers themselves changed the landscape. They didn't just use the natural landscape there. They did use it to their advantage, but they actually changed the landscape. And that changed landscape is still with us today. So you can go to the stretch of line at Spotsylvania Courthouse where the 96th Pennsylvania were, in that vicinity, and you can actually see those trenches. Don't go in them, because we preserve our earthworks, but you can see them. You can see the line that they dug, the trenches that they dug, and the same on the Confederate line as well, the Mule Shoe. Much more significant defensive fortifications that you can see still etched into the landscape. It's pretty cool to be able to travel there. And Spotsylvania Courthouse is not one of those battlefields that is a place that has hordes of visitors coming to. So if you're in the vicinity in Central Virginia, I highly recommend checking out the Spotsylvania battlefield for this very reason, to see the trenches these soldiers dug, see the locations where they were, and understand the conditions that they were facing under very hellish circumstances in May of 1864. So as these two armies, the Army of the Potomac, the U.S. Army, the Army of Northern Virginia, the Confederate Army, kind of dig in at Spotsylvania in May of 1864, artillery fire is going to become pretty intense. As was mentioned at the opening of the program with Dr. Daniel Webster Bland, as he is talking about the intense artillery fire. This is a major feature of the fighting at Spotsylvania Courthouse. And as this shelling is taking place on the morning of May 10th, 1864, a Confederate shell comes across from the Mule Shoe salient, passes over a brow of a hill, and slammed into a stack of rifles adjacent to the bivouac of Captain Severn's Company K. In a shower of metal shrapnel, 7 men were torn to pieces, including Captain Severn. The force of the explosion and the hail of iron fractured Severn's right arm. It smashed his elbow to pieces and left a gaping wound near his shoulder, severely damaging his scapula and clavicle as well. The stricken captain and his men were evacuated to a field hospital about a mile away near a pine thicket that was out of range of Confederate artillery. That is where Surgeon Bland and other members of the 6th Corps, their medical department, set up a field hospital for all of the wounded coming in from the front lines just a mile or so away. So once at this makeshift hospital, the regimental surgeon of the 96th Pennsylvania, a native of Schuylkill County, Dr. Bland and others, unanimously decided that Captain Severn's shattered arm needed to be removed at the shoulder. This was a particularly bold step. Only 24% of those undergoing amputation at the shoulder survived their wounds. Additionally, damaged pieces of the scapula and clavicle needed to be removed as well. So this is a particularly dangerous surgery that Dr. Bland is going to be endeavoring to complete in far less than ideal circumstances. This operation is going to be conducted in the evening of May 10th, under, in some cases, they're going to mention under candlelight that this operation is going to be completed. So again, less than ideal circumstances here. The surgeons do chloroform. They use chloroform as anesthetic on Captain Severn. I would be remiss if I did not mention this, that 95+% of surgeries performed during the Civil War were performed under some form of anesthesia, chloroform or ether, both used widely. In this case, chloroform is going to be used on the shattered body of Captain Severn. So after he is chloroformed, after Dr. Bland administers the chloroform, he is going to begin to care for the stricken limb. He's going to carefully cut away the torn muscle and tissue and get down to the bone. He references performing the surgery in his case notes, which were published. And this is going to be that next level of research. We start with a newspaper clipping where the surgeon is writing about this one patient. And then we find that this patient's case history is at the Army Medical Museum. It's collected by the Army Medical Museum. Now, our friends at the National Museum of Health and Medicine preserve these case notes and have, in many cases, digitized them. And so this is what we learn that from Dr. Bland himself about this patient and how he treated Captain Severn. He says, quote, "The unanimous conclusion of several medical officers being for immediate removal of the arm at the shoulder joint with as much of the clavicle and scapula as were seriously involved. The patient was chloroformed, and Surgeon D. Webster Bland, U.S. Volunteers, removed the injured member at the shoulder joint, making a superior flap from the deltoid muscle, disarticulating the head of the bone, and cutting the lower flap from the inner side of the arm. Hemorrhage being arrested by ligatures, the wound over the clavicle was enlarged by an incision in the direction of the bone. The loose spiculae were carefully removed and either end of the clavicle sawn off, thus removing about 4 inches of this bone. The fragments of the superior part of the scapula with the loose and damaged integument were then removed. The wounds over the scapula and clavicle were closed with the interrupted suture and a stimulant with anodyne administered. This operation was performed in the midst of a dense wood at 5:00 p.m., aided by the light of half a dozen candles." So pretty intense there, and a lot of medical language, but basically cutting away most of Captain Severn's shoulder, and that had been just ripped apart by this Confederate artillery shell and fragments from these dozen rifles that were struck by the artillery fire. And so this is a very, very dangerous wound. And we learned from the case history that later that night of May 10th, 1864, and then the hours after the amputation takes place, Captain Severn is moved via ambulance on to Fredericksburg, Virginia, along with many other patients from the 6th Corps, going to join other patients from the United States Army being evacuated to Fredericksburg. And they're made as comfortable as they can, but the conditions are pretty awful as they're being transported. The roads are particularly muddy. There's a backup, a traffic jam. Fredericksburg is going to receive more than 20,000 patients in the weeks during and immediately after the battles of the Wilderness and Spotsylvania Courthouse. It is not a particularly good situation for these soldiers to be in, these wounded soldiers. We know also a little bit about Captain Severn's surgery because there's a remarkable photograph taken in the years after the Civil War showing the wounds for the purposes of recording the treatment that Captain Severn was administered on the Spotsylvania battlefield, again preserved by the Army Medical Museum as well. And including with that photo is another history of Captain Severn's case written by Dr. Bland himself. And this is what he says. He says, quote, "Wounded on the 10th of May, 1864 in front of Spotsylvania Courthouse, wound caused by the explosion of a case shot fired by the enemy. 7 men were wounded by the shot, 4 of whom died. Right arm removed at shoulder joint, 3 inches of the clavicle, a small portion of scapula, ending in complete recovery. The operation was performed by D. Webster Bland, surgeon, 96th Pennsylvania, and late medical inspector of the 6th Corps, and provides an update as well. It says, March 22nd, 1867, Captain S is still alive and doing well, and writes very legibly with his left hand, and is sober and industrious. It was written by Dr. D.W. Bland, MD, of Pottsville, Pennsylvania. And so we follow there. We follow Captain Severn home. He goes from the field hospital at Spotsylvania to Fredericksburg, Virginia. From Fredericksburg, Virginia, transported to hospitals in Washington, D.C., where he is going to linger for quite a long time before being ruled safe enough and recovered enough to return to his home. And he's going to return back to Schuylkill County, back to Pottsville, and his wife, Mary. More on Mary in just a moment. And he is going to kind of begin adapting to a life without his right arm. In a society that looks down upon many of those with disabilities, he is going to have to adapt to life. And by all accounts, he adapts pretty well. And I think that's in part because he is an officer, because he was a captain, and he loses his arm in the service, in a battle. Just for to add in some context here for the 96th Pennsylvania, they are going to suffer horrific casualties later in the day on May 10th, 1864, when they're involved in a charge, what's known as Upton's charge, at Spotsylvania Courthouse. Captain Severn and his colleagues and comrades in Company K that were wounded in this shell explosion obviously do not participate in that fight. But the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse becomes relatively famous at home on the Pennsylvania home front because this unit is going to be involved in intense combat there. And so there is a bit of kind of heroism that is going to be kind of beloved by members of the home front, by family members, by those of serving, those family and friends of those serving in the 96th Pennsylvania. And so Captain Severn, with his shattered right and his lost right arm, are going to be looked at as a physical reminder of the fight at Spotsylvania Courthouse and its intensity and ferocity. And he was, by all accounts, Captain Severn was a man who was very heavily involved in his community. He's going to move from the town of Pottsville to a new kind of community growing up in Schuylkill County called Mahanoy City. He eventually took up the role of postmaster for the borough, and became a kind of local leader. And the local Grand Army of the Republic post in Mahanoy was named in his honor as well. But he died in 1872, was buried in Pottsville, Pennsylvania, among many of his comrades in the 96th Pennsylvania, what is known as Charles Baber Cemetery. So the surgery, just to kind of tie up this section of our program, the surgery that Severn experienced on the battlefield at Spotsylvania Courthouse is consistent with that administered to tens of thousands of soldiers during the Civil War. More than 60,000 amputations took place during the conflict, and despite the lack of knowledge of things like germ theory and the lack of general cleanliness in these Civil War field hospitals, Captain Edwin Severn's example shows that patients did survive these. Many of these amputees are going to return home and have to try to adapt to their lives on the home front. And doctors like Surgeon Bland are going to become some of the most skillful surgeons in the world just because of the nature of their experiences on the battlefields of the Civil War. So I mentioned Captain Severn goes home to Pennsylvania, becomes a postmaster in his adopted hometown. Dr. Bland goes back to Schuylkill County as well and becomes a railroad surgeon on the Reading Railroad in the vicinity of Pottsville, Pennsylvania, and of a line that went from Pottsville to Philadelphia, about 80 to 100 miles away from Philadelphia. And so he will be called out in railroad accidents, will be called out to administer to railroad workers who were injured, as well as passengers who may have been injured in railway accidents, which were pretty rampant at the end of the 19th century. And so he is going to be using his battlefield experiences to treat civilians on the home front, civilians at home in the aftermath of the Civil War. So Dr. Bland's experience on the battlefield is going to actually translate pretty well to his circumstances back home upon his return. Now, before I go out today, before I finish up our program, I did want to mention and bring in another character into our story here, and that is of Mary Severn. And Mary Severn is Captain Edwin Severn's wife. And she has herself a fascinating story, and one that I think I think you'll enjoy, and one that I think is necessary to understand that the Civil War amputation, Civil War operations, Civil War battlefields, the Civil War in general is not just being fought by the men at the front lines. It is also being fought by their families at home who are struggling to hear news from their loved ones, fearing for their lives, and the consequences of if something should happen to them on the battlefield. And so Mary Severn's story is interesting and unique to her, but also represents something that thousands of other women were also experiencing. She was born as Mary Wolfinger on September 17th, 1839 in Pottsville, Pennsylvania. And in the years leading up to the Civil War, she does marry her husband, Edwin L. Severn, and they lived in Pottsville in the years leading up to the Civil War. Mary was listed in 1860 as a tailoress, so she has experience as a tailor in the years leading up to the Civil War while she's living in Pottsville, Pennsylvania. Her husband goes off to war, and we kind of lose track of Mary at that point of where she's living, what she's doing during the war years. But what we do know is that we can pick her up in 1865 upon the return of her husband. Captain Severn, shattered, broken by his experience in battle, ripped apart by a Confederate artillery shell. Mary has the job that was faced by, again, thousands of other American women: how to care for a disabled husband whose limbs have been shattered and broken by battle, whose spirits in many cases have been broken by battle as well, and to adapt to life as best they can in the years after the Civil War. So in this way, the Civil War's legacy carrying farther, much farther than April or May of 1865 when the war comes to a close. We're going to be dealing with the longstanding conflict consequences of these battles, these fights in the decades to come. So in 1865, we do know that Captain Severn returns to Mary. They do move to Mahanoy City, as I already mentioned, and businesses are going to be started. Captain Severn is going to sell insurance before becoming the postmaster. But he's going to pass away in 1872 at a relatively young age, and that is going to leave Mary in an interesting situation. Mary Severn is going to do something that I was not particularly familiar with until reading about and investigating her story. And she is actually going to replace her husband as postmaster of the community of Mahanoy City, Pennsylvania, after his death in 1872. Now, a little note about the post office in these days. This is one of the rare, especially in the years leading up to the Civil War, one of the rare ways in which the federal government actually impacted the lives of everyday citizens, of people going about their everyday life. Very little connection to the federal government in the 19th century. The post office is one of the areas where there is communication. This is a federally appointed position, the position of postmasters. You can go through and find the records of presidential appointments for postmaster. Now, of course, those decisions are not necessarily being made at the presidential level. It's much more local decisions that are going to lead to those appointments. But one of the interesting aspects is that when a postmaster would be appointed, they would have a deputy postmaster who would be their assistant, who would also be appointed and kind of chosen at the selection of the postmaster who had been appointed. They could pick their deputy. And in this case, Edwin Severn chooses his wife Mary as the deputy postmaster in 1872. Severn is appointed by Ulysses S. Grant as the postmaster in Mahanoy City. And this is common for disabled officers specifically, going to find opportunities at positions like this. And we see this from Dr. Bland mentioning in his case notes that Captain Severn could write very legibly with his left hand, one of the soldiers who will have to relearn how to write with their left hand because of the loss of their right. But shortly in the months after his appointment, Captain Severn dies under circumstances that have not been able to find, whether this is related to his wartime injuries, wounds that would have likely not healed completely, still a possibility of being open wounds as well. You can kind of see that in the photograph. It's still a very gnarly looking wound in the years after the Civil War is over. Very much something that could have hampered Captain Severn's life in the years after the Civil War. But his wife is going to take over for him. As deputy postmaster, it is her responsibility upon the incapacitation of the postmaster to take over that responsibility. And so for the next 8 years, Mary Severn is going to act as the postmaster of Mahanoy City, which is fascinating. And her deputy is going to be her teenage daughter, is going to be her deputy postmaster. And so she's raising small children and raising them in the post office at Mahanoy City, and she has replaced her husband in that role, and she is going to come into that role herself. What they refer to as the postmistress of Mahanoy City, Mary Severn. She sits in that position, which was politically appointed, and she's going to hold that position until 1880. And she's going to be replaced under kind of murky circumstances, some political backdealing. But there is going to be quite a stink raised when Mary Severn loses her position. And some of the veterans of the Civil War, veterans who served alongside her husband, Edwin Severn, in the ranks of the first defenders in April 1861, or the 96th Pennsylvania, are going to be very upset when she is replaced. Politicians kind of making some backroom deals to give their friends patronage jobs, something that is very famous and used widely in the 19th century. Mary Severn loses her job. But in the course of this complicated, complex situation where she's kind of in between losing her job and actually being kind of put out from the Mahanoy City Post Office, the veterans in this area are going to write on her behalf to Washington unsuccessfully. But in those writings, they say some interesting things. Most of that relates around the idea that because she is a widow of a U.S. Army officer who was severely wounded and disabled by his service in the Civil War, that she was herself a daughter of the country, that she herself was a hero of sorts for caring for this disabled soldier, and that in his absence, she had this role, performed it admirably, and should have the respect of her fellow citizens, and the government should respect that respect, and should allow her to continue on with that job. Of course, that is not what happened for Mary Severn. She loses her position as the postmaster of Mahanoy City, and goes on to become a tailor, opening her own tailoring business, and will live into the 20th century. I wanted to bring in her side of the story here, just to say that the Civil War has wide implications, and not just for the soldiers themselves, but also for the friends and family of those who are going to be caring for wounded soldiers, sick soldiers during the Civil War, and dealing with their long-standing health consequences in the years after the Civil War. So that brings an end to my program for today. Thank you for tuning in with me. I hope you enjoyed learning about the kind of specifics of a case that I found very compelling, with some very interesting images as well. I hope you've enjoyed the program. If you did, please go ahead and click that like button on this video, subscribe to our channel for more content like this and to get alerts about when we put up a new video. And share the video as well if you enjoyed the program. That helps more people to see it, get involved in the conversation. If you do have any questions, feel free to add those into the comments section. Happy to answer those questions for you when we see them at the museum, and our social media moderators. And if you want to, again, take that support to the next level for the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, please consider becoming a member of the museum. That will give you great perks, also supports programs and research like this. We love studying this conflict and its medical consequences. We believe very strongly that there is hope in history, that we can find modern relevance in the past, to look back 160 years to the American Civil War and say, wow, this is not just barbaric, this is not just archaic medicine and they lack knowledge, but there's actually lessons we can apply. The lessons that they learned, that they were forced to evolve under fire, under pressure in one of the nation's worst healthcare crises in our nation's history, that they were able to create systems that saved the lives of countless people during the conflict. We can learn from that. You can support our endeavors by becoming a member of the museum. So you'll find a link in the comment section and in the description of the video. Hope you'll consider it. Support the museum, support stories like this, support programs like this. With all of that being said, again, my name is Jake Wynn. I'm Director of Interpretation at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. We will see you next time. Have a great day.